Thank you for joining us for today's session. I'm your host, Debbie Mathias with the BUILD Initiative. We'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement from Giovanna Archuleta, Assistant Secretary for the New Mexico Early Childhood Education and Care Department.
I would like to open up this meeting acknowledging our Mother Earth and the land she nurtures us with, the land where our children grow, and the land that provides the food to feed them. When we talk about these resources, we must also acknowledge the lands of our tribal people and the deep spiritual and long-standing relationship of all tribal nations. Today I come from you from Nambe-Awinge, the land of my ancestors who cared for it and fought for it so that I may one day live and raise my own children on it. A relationship that predates colonial contact by thousands of years. Our ancestors still speak to us and guide us through our songs, ceremonies, and writings. Through removal, trail of tears, long walks, assimilation, and the idea that by removing children would kill a culture. Our ancestors did not give up. Our tribal people are some of the most resilient people in our country, continuing to raise children to be resilient, who are nurtured through language and culture, the language and culture that cannot be removed. We must also acknowledge all other spirits who were forcefully displaced from their homelands and trafficked for labor and production on sacred native land. All of us collectively continue to experience the adversity that caused our ancestors and spirits who continue to hurt from actions done to them. Take a moment to pray these people find the healing and peace to raise their children in a world that has so many opportunities, but most importantly, create coexistence free of violence. Tribal people are praying people. This is where we are all tied. Our grandmothers and mothers continue to pray over us. And as tribal people pray, they pray for people in the north, in the east, in the south, and the west. They pray for infants, children, adults, and elders, and our non-human relations, each with knowledge to share with us. As this conference begins, I hope that each of you are balanced in all directions and take a moment to appreciate what Mother Earth has given to us and how she continues to nurture us in many ways. I invite and encourage you to learn who are the original stewards of the land you live and work on and support those nations and children of those land. Thank you.
The BUILD team is excited to present this 20 webinars in 20 days for QRIS 2020 as we explore ideas, possibilities, and learn together about how we might recreate better, more equitable systems with children, families, and early childhood professionals at the center of our efforts. We're grateful to the many individuals who took time to prepare sessions, generate content, and ideas to share. We believe the sessions will inspire you to build on these ideas, continue conversations, and innovate back in your own communities and states. We've learned a great deal as we've prepared for the virtual sessions. One of our lessons is that a virtual event draws a much broader audience than an in-person conference. The BUILD QRIS conference was designed for early childhood system leaders at the national, state, territory, tribal, nation, and community levels. As registration rolled in for the virtual event, we discovered many direct service providers, from teachers to center directors and home-based providers signing up for the sessions. We welcome you to our learning community and look forward to hearing your perspective. We encourage you to share your comments, ideas, and questions in the chat box. As you know, we had to pivot from our in-person conference to a virtual one. We'd like to say a sincere thank you to our sponsors who made that switch possible. Their support's essential to this event. Well, we've all become familiar with the Zoom platform over the past few months, maybe too familiar, as we've used it to connect with friends, family, community, and colleagues. we want to point out a few features that might be new to you. First, when the PowerPoint isn't showing, you can choose your view. In the upper right-hand corner, click on Speaker View to see the active speaker, or click on Gallery View to see everyone who has their cameras on. Next, we encourage you to provide feedback throughout the session by clicking on the participant icon along the bottom to open the participant list, and then click on the icons at the bottom to respond to questions or give us a thumbs up. Presenters might use this feature to do some quick polling, so be ready. Make sure to chat with us. We encourage you to be active participants in the session. Please share your experiences, ideas, and questions in the chat box. There are polls in this session. A box will pop up on your screen, and we encourage you to respond. This helps us generate more conversation and enhances our learning together. Well, now I'd like to turn it over to Lucy Riccio, and she's going to introduce our presenters and launch our session. It's all yours, Lucy.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today, and I thank you for opening up this space for us to come together in conversation. I would like to first appreciate and thank everyone. As Debbie said, my name is Lucy Riccio, and I am the Senior Public Policy and Advocacy Analyst at the National Association for the Education of Young Children, NAEYC. And I have the deep privilege of being joined today by my co-presenters, Georgia Goldburn, who is the Director of Hope for New Haven, a child care program in the New Haven, Connecticut area, and Ghazi Lawal, who is the Program Director for the Center for the Study of Social Policies, CSSP, their Prenatal to 3 initiative, and Chantel Meek, who is the Founding Director for the Children's Equity Project. Now, as we begin, I want to make sure we establish clear expectations around the discussion ahead of us. As we begin our time together, we will unearth the racism and classism embedded in the history of this sector and how it manifests itself today in our field. As we find ourselves literally the child care sector fighting for survival in light of the devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the sector, we hope you will be able to walk away from our time together understanding how the history of oppression, marginalization, and intentional exclusion that has permeated our country's history has had a direct translation in the reality we find ourselves living today. A reality where we do not have universal childcare, although that was something that our country did from 1941 to 1946 through the Lanham Act that recognized childcare as the public good that it was then and continues to be today, without tying it to income, but rather recognizing that it is necessary for the economic prosperity and progress of our society and our country, and something that should not be afforded or not to some families based on who they are and the work that they do, but rather that it is something that will benefit all of us. And so while we are confronted with this very difficult reality today, we hope that you will understand how the history of our country has informed this reality and how it presents an opportunity for us to reimagine and recreate a childcare system that is far better than the one that existed prior to this pandemic. We will also spend time today, hopefully, where you will understand what conversations are possible in order for us to collectively chip away at racism in the early childhood education profession, recognizing that we each play a role in reimagining this system in order to best serve young children, their families, this profession, and our society as a large. And finally, we hope that we will walk away with actionable items to affect change at the system level in federal, state, and local policies, within organizations, and inside classrooms. As you all saw when you registered for this session, we really want you to think about this globally and how it presents itself again in the society at large, but also the deep role and work that has to happen at an individual level for us to carry this work forward. And so as we enter into this conversation, one of the things that I want to make sure that we understand is how this conversation really surfaced up for us as an organization. And for NAEYC, it really is important that this is inextricably tied to our Advancing Equity in Early Childhood Education position statement. The Advancing Equity in Early Childhood Education position statement is one of 5 foundational documents NAEYC has developed in collaboration with the early childhood profession, and it was a position statement that was released last year. It accompanies our developmentally appropriate practice position statement, professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators, which was released earlier this year as a result of the Power to the Profession initiative. It also sits with our Code of Ethical Conduct, as well as the NAEYC Early Childhood Program Standards that really determine the practice and the scope of work for accredited early learning programs. And so our Advancing Equity position statement really forms the foundation for the work that NAEYC as an organization carries out. It is built upon a growing body of research and professional knowledge that underscores the complex and critical ways early childhood educators promote early learning, recognizing that it is a profession that is deeply contingent on the relationships that educators have with children, their families, their colleagues, and by extension, the world around them. And yet what we also know, and what this position statement recognizes, is that these relationships are embedded within a broader societal context of inequities, where both implicit and explicit biases are pervasive. So that in essence means that we show up to this work as our full selves. And a lot of the biases that we hold ultimately will translate into the classroom, into the relationships and interactions that we have with young children, with their families. And so if we really want to operate from a space of being anti-racist, we have to recognize that we are not immune to those biases and how we can explicitly call them out in order to remove them from the work that happens in these programs. And so the primary focus for the statement then is equitable learning opportunities for young children, and it makes recommendations for early childhood educators and administrators working in all settings. Again, really thinking about the role that NAEYC plays as the professional membership organization for over 60,000 individuals who work with young children, birth to age 8. And so how these recommendations in this position statement will explicitly speak to them. Yet what we know is that these opportunities for early childhood educators and child care providers and administrators to provide this equitable learning opportunity for all young children, these opportunities depend on equitable treatments of educators. And so the position statement also includes specific recommendations for workplaces, for higher education preparation programs, and policymakers as they seek to improve equitable access to high quality early childhood education. After this session, you will receive a link to be able to go through the position statements and spend time really digging into those recommendations if you haven't done so up until now, because this is not a session where we're going to talk at length about that. It's more so how we're going to operationalize and the opportunities that are available for you to operationalize many of the things that are within the position statement. And so to that end, I want to just highlight what is it that the position statement does assert, right? What is it that is undoubtedly and undeniably being called out as part of this position statement? The first and foremost is that all children have the right to equitable learning opportunities that help them achieve their full potential. Also, that all early childhood educators have a professional obligation to advance equity, right? This is calling out that if you call yourself an early childhood educator and are part of the early childhood profession, that you then are also embracing and accepting this obligation you have to advance equity. And that early childhood educators need support to fulfill this mission. Again, recognizing that this work does not happen in a vacuum. And so in order for early childhood educators to be able to meet this obligation, there are changes that must happen at the program level, at the state, local level, at the federal level, really thinking about the system that child care falls under and is a part of. And now in order for us to really think about this, we know that this is not just a call to the field, right? This is not just a call to early childhood educators and program directors across the country, but this is also a call to action for NAEYC. And to that end, it is really important that as an organization, if our central goal is to nurture a more diverse and inclusive generation of young children who thrive through their experiences of equitable learning opportunities in early learning programs, in a way that is executed through a commitment to continuous learning, both individually and collectively, based on reflections of how our beliefs and actions have been shaped by our experiences. It really is important for us to think about, okay, so what does this mean for us? What does this mean for NAEYC as an organization? Yes, the call to action that was issued to our fields, to the early childhood educators and members of the child care sector, but as an organization, how do we then push towards becoming a more diverse, high-performing, and inclusive organization? And in many ways, that work for us has manifested in how we approach and really think about many of our lines of business, right, and how we operate as an organization. Really thinking about how we are reevaluating, restructuring, and redefining how we operate from our approach, that is the approach that we take towards our governing board recruitments and who are the individuals that will guide the way in which NAEYC moves forward through this very difficult time, but also into the future. Thinking how we approach our own hiring and recruitment practices and retention practices, and how we position ourselves in this field in partnership with other national organizations, but also truly living out our commitments that early childhood educators are the experts in the work that they do, and that any policy or advocacy pushes really come from their lived experiences and their expertise. So really thinking of how do we make sure that they continue to provide the North Star that guides and directs our work, and how we support them in doing that. And then finally, it has challenged us as an organization to think about the ways in which we provide financial and technical supports to our 51 affiliates who lead this work as a direct point of contact with our members in their communities. It is a journey that challenges us to continuously assess how we are living up to this position statement, and how we continue to remain anchored by an institutional commitment to operate in this space as an anti-racist organization. And so I share that just to be able to illustrate how, as an organization, we really are thinking this both internally as well as the call to action that is happening externally. And so with that, I now want to turn to Chantel, who will lead us in a short activity that will hopefully illustrate how our perceptions help inform our realities. Chantel?
Thank you, Lucy. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be with you all today to talk about some really important issues in equity. So we want to start by conducting a few polls just to see where we land, and then kind of discussing the responses. So can we pull up the first poll, please? So the first poll is: race is biological. It's a true or false answer. So we'll wait a minute or so to get the results in. Okay, great. So we have about a third of folks who responded true and about 2/3 of folks who responded false. So the truth here is the 2/3 of folks who answered false were correct. Race is not biological. In fact, it's a social construct. It's a classification of human beings that was politically defined. What we know is that human beings are actually over 99% similar, that there's actually more variation in a flock of penguins than within humans, and that we see more variation within races than across races. Race was a concept that was made up, essentially. It was a social construct. So that's a really important, I think, foundational baseline to kind of jump and move forward from in this conversation. Can we pull up the next poll, please? Great. So if we can pull up the next slide, please. We got most folks answered false. About 15% answered true. So most folks were right. Race did not come before racism, so that is false is the correct answer. Racism came first, and we know that race is actually the child of racism. Because of the belief that many folks have that race is biological, the idea that race came first is quite common. In reality, racist ideology came first. This desire for power combined with racist ideology really prompted the construction and making up of race and racial categories. Originally to justify slavery and to consolidate power. Can we get the next poll, please? Next question is, reverse racism exists, true or false? Great, so the breakup was similar to that first question where we have about a third of folks answering true and about 2/3, a little less than 2/3 answering false. So the correct answer is false. Reverse racism actually does not exist for one main reason. Racism requires power and systemic power and the power to oppress. It is not just, prejudice and bias. It's really prejudice and bias combined and with the necessary component of power. And so non-white individuals in the United States simply do not have that systemic power to oppress white communities and white individuals. And so while bias and prejudice can certainly exist across and between all types of folks, the necessary component of power is missing in order for reverse racism to be true. So next poll is a bit different. It's not true or false. It's asking, how old do you think the child in this photo is? 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7? Great, so we have a bit of a distribution. About 1 in 5 or 20% of folks thought he was 3. About half of the folks thought he was 4. About a quarter thought he was 5. And just about 4% thought he was 6, and nobody thought he was 7. So the correct answer is 3. The boy in this picture is 3. And we asked this question because it has some really significant effects. Research finds that Black boys are often perceived to be 4.5 years older than they are. And that has really significant consequences. We know that, for example, there are several factors that are associated with a higher risk of being suspended or expelled from early childhood settings. They include being big or tall or large, which could be associated with, thinking a child is older than they actually are. So this perception of bigger, being a boy, and being Black, as my friend Walter Gilliam often says, kind of those 3 Bs. And if you think about it, none of those factors have anything to do with challenging behavior or anything that the child does. It's all about how the child looks. So we like to really, kind of ground ourselves in this, because it doesn't only stop with boys. There are also biases in the way in that affect our perceptions and our decisions and our assumptions about Black girls. There's a study recently out of Georgetown University that found that Black girls were perceived as needing less protection, as being older, as being more sexualized, a number of things that really leads and points to the adultification of Black children. We saw this tragically play out with Elijah McClain, the young Black boy who was murdered he was restrained by police, and then paramedics came or the fire station came and gave him some kind of sedative. He was 140 pounds and they gave him enough for someone who was 220 pounds. And that ultimately contributed to his death. And so we see that these perceptions of how our biases influence our perceptions of people and our behavior and the way that we perceive behavior and the decisions can be really significant. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Ngozi Lawal, to take it from here.
Thank you, Chantel. So I'm Ngozi Lawal, and I am the project director at CSSP. Really happy to be with you all today and be a part of this discussion. So I'll just kick off my portion with just a quote for you to consider. Now, I don't know whether the author's name is Kara or Kara, so forgive me for that, but it's a pretty important quote that we thought would be important to just get you thinking about what we're talking about today. So she says, "The past informs the present. Memory makes the map we carry, no matter how hard we try to erase it." So we think talking about the past is a really important way to think about where we are and ultimately where we want to go. So on the surface, racism may sound like something that happens to someone else in some other place, and that it may not seem so connected to one's everyday life. But in fact, racism is a system that's connected to all of us. It's a system of advantage and oppression, and we are all touched by it. And when you break it down, as pointed out here, racism is social and institutional power and racial prejudice. That's essentially the recipe. It's important to face history to know a bit about our country's history and understand racism in America today. So when we look back, we can see that, 1619, we have the record of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans. And there's this important point in history around 1766 where a militia led by Nathaniel Bacon brought together Black servants and white servants and slaves and destroyed the colonial capital, Jamestown in Virginia. One of the important
Ngazi, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, I hope you didn't miss too much. I was just walking through the timeline and talking about Bacon's Rebellion and how important that is in the history of our nation, where Nathaniel Bacon brought together Black and white servants as well as slaves to help overturn the powers that be in the colony Virginia. As a result of this, a couple other, this type of protest and insurrection happened in a few other places. And so governors and others in power began to see that their footing was being compromised, their place of power was being compromised. And it was at that point that you began to see an abandonment of having indentured servants, and this push towards bringing in slaves for labor. And the thinking here being that if you bring more slaves in, you can have more control, and you could grow your status and economic power. And then you see a couple centuries later, the practice of slavery is happening and flourishing and continuing. And, we tend to think from our high school or even college history lessons that, once slavery was over, things were better for African Americans. But, as you can see, there's this whole period of Black codes and Jim Crow laws that followed us well into the 20th century. So we begin with the dehumanization of Black lives. And we talk about that because we want everyone to really make sure that you're really focusing in on the fact that we begin with this idea that in order to obtain power and wealth, the thinking is that someone has to be oppressed. Okay, so that's a really important concept here. And so we as a nation justify this practice to maintain this wealth and power. And we really cemented this and followed through with policies and practices. And so these efforts in turn led to widespread prejudices and even more racist policies and practices. So it has a culminating effect. So back to our timeline, you'll see that in this visual that's presented, that slavery to segregation represents 88% of our timeline from the time that European settlers arrived. And I just really want to underline this point of the arrival of European settlers, because we know that the nation also had a history of the disenfranchisement of Native Americans, which is a whole nother history lesson, whole other important history lesson, but we're focusing today on the disenfranchisement of African Americans in this country. And then just, wanted to point out that, even after slavery had officially ended, we have a whole period of Jim Crow, mass incarcerations, and a real fight for social justice and equality. So we wanted to talk a little bit today about our nation's history because we think it's really important that we understand why we see the kinds of disparities that we see today. We have this really bad habit of talking about data points without considering or thinking about how did we get here and what are the policies and practices that got us to where we are. So we want to just talk a little bit about discrimination in the housing space. So in 1937, the United States Housing Act was passed, and part of what that act did was to intentionally segregate metropolitan areas. So 2 bullets below just give you some examples of some of the pieces that are in this policy. So for example, part of the policy required that integrated neighborhoods be demolished, completely torn apart in order to segregate for public housing. So this is not something that just kind of organically happened. That's not why we see the neighborhoods, the division in neighborhoods the way we do today. This was really intentional. And I just want to park here to say that as we think about what we do in this early care and education space, as Lucy and Chantel pointed out in their remarks, it is really important that we use a racial lens. This is not something to shy away from or to back away from or to be polite about. When you think about the policies like these and how they were very intentional in segregating and oppressing groups of people, it's very important that we put on our hat to think about how can we be intentional about undoing the kinds of inequitable practices. So I hope that encourages you to be really bold when talking with your colleagues and thinking about solutions in your space, regardless of what that space is in the early care and education world. And also to encourage some introspection on your part in thinking about what are your individual levers and power that you have as an individual to make changes. So the second, the second example that's in this Housing Act intentionally refused to insure mortgages in and near African American neighborhoods. Many of you will know that policy as redlining. Next slide, please. Also in the housing space, there in 1936, so this is the year before the Housing Act that I just talked about came out, and you can find this if you look hard enough. The Underwriting Manual of 1936, which is developed by the Federal Housing Administration. We still have the FHA today. It is alive and well. And that's important to just keep in mind because these things that we talk about are not so far removed. We tend to think that slavery happened zillions of years ago. And for those of you who are young enough, you might think the Jim Crow era was also zillions of years ago. But these are policies and practices that came about actually fairly recently. So as I pointed out, in 1936, the Underwriting Manual of the FHA implied that racial groups could not coexist and forbade the groups from living in the same communities. And this policy freely gave financing to builders to mass produce homes in the suburbs to white families, and in the same breath forbade the sale or resale of these homes to African Americans. So this is not a story of economics, of whether you have the money or not to buy the house. It is about the color of your skin. The authors of these policies were very strategic, and you'll see the last example here, that there was actually a recommendation in this manual to enforce segregation through the erection of highways to physically separate Black and white neighborhoods. Again, all of these things were very intentional in maintaining systemic oppression. So we want to talk a little bit about the implications of racial segregation. And we asked the question, why does this matter? Because we want you to know that despite the freeing of the slaves, African Americans continue to face oppression at all levels, particularly socially and economically. And so here's what we saw. Here are some of the outcomes. As a result of these policies, African Americans were prevented from home ownership and from building wealth, which is home ownership is a really important way of building wealth in this country. So, you know, just stop and think about that. You have 2 generations denied the ability to build wealth through home ownership. And, you know, when you think about wealth, you know, there's the data point of African-American wealth is about 5 to 7% of white wealth. When you look at that data point in isolation, depending on what you know or may not know, there might be some bias that you have that drives you to a conclusion of why that is. There are all kinds of ideas we might have about why African-American wealth today is only 5 to 7% of white wealth. But when you take into context what we're talking about today, you can begin to see the pieces of the puzzle coming together. You can see the culminating effects of segregation. The second bullet that we have here talks about how Black neighborhoods were made undesirable through this process. Some were intentionally zoned for industrial and toxic uses, like a dumping ground. So think about that. And then the last point that we present here, certainly not the last, as in there isn't any more, but the last point on this slide has to do with when you think about the employment discrimination, the housing discrimination, and how the income of residents in a community contributes to the tax base, and how the tax base plays a huge role in funding schools, and you end up with poorly funded schools. It helps to complete the sentence, and it helps you to see the whole picture of why we have the kind of poverty, in some places abject poverty, that we see today. So housing is not the only place where we see discriminatory practices. It's everywhere. And that's what we're encouraging you to do today. Use your lens to see racism everywhere that it exists, because it really is everywhere. So just a couple of examples, and then just for you to consider, there are many more. These are, so the examples that I talked about before are policies and practices that were instituted at the federal level. And these are policies presented here from the state level. So the first example that's presented is Virginia's Vagrancy Act of 1866. And this law imprisoned people, particularly Black people. Now, it was written and argued that it applied to everybody, but I think we can all put on our thinking caps and really think about who exactly this law was created for. Think about the timing, 1866, right? So this is right after slaves were supposedly emancipated. And so this law required the imprisonment of those who were unemployed or homeless. If you're discriminated against from getting a job, it's really hard to avoid the consequences of this law. And then if you were imprisoned because you couldn't get a job, then you were forced to work for no compensation. And so one of the ways in which this was sold to the public was playing on white beliefs and white fears. And so this idea that vagrants are a threat to public safety, that they're idle and therefore disorderly, and that they could become beggars or thieves was incentive enough to pass something like this. So this is something that benefited white society because these low wages were artificially created, and that then forced African Americans to take those jobs because they didn't want to become in prison. So they wanted to avoid arrest, but at the same time were working these incredibly low wages. So these wages, of course, were inadequate for African Americans to support their families. So it just kind of gives you a progression of how simple words in a policy can have these really compounding implications. In the next example here with AFDC, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, that's the predecessor to the TANF welfare policy that we have today, the Temporary Aid for Needy Families. In AFDC, many states picked up, which is a federal law, but many states picked up this notion of a man in the house rule, where primarily women, who were primarily the ones receiving the benefit, would become disqualified if an adult male was in the home. And so, as Chantel pointed out in her presentation, these prejudices and biases of questionable sexual morality of Black women was one way in which these kinds of policies were produced and sold. So the implications of this is that African American families who needed the support couldn't often get the support that they needed. And you know, often what we saw with making these political arguments and selling it to the public was that this kind of implementation, this rule, would help bring down the national debt. It would keep taxes from rising. And, you know, of course, there's this concept that existed and still exists of the welfare queen, a Black woman who is just not desiring to work, who's lazy, and just wants to collect federal resources as her source of income. So there's just this image here of boots, and we asked the question, where are the straps? And if we had more time, we'd probably show a blank slide asking where are the boots, right? So there's this thinking of, you know, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Why can't these Black people just get it together? When you consider the history and you think about what has happened and the really intentional ways in which African American families were denied and continue to be denied opportunities to advance and improve, it really, you begin to take apart this idea of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps if there are no laces, or you got laces, but they continue to be taken from you. So we leave you with that image just so that you can think about, in the early care and education space, are we ensuring that families have the boots and the straps and the necessary supports that they need to function as a family unit? And I'll turn it back over to Chantel.
So I want to kind of continue the conversation with this metaphor, or this story that was put together by the Racial Equity Institute out of North Carolina. And it's about a fish in a lake. And so imagine you're out walking in a big open field and you come across a lake. And you look down and there's a fish that's belly up dead in the lake. You might look at the fish and you might wonder, I wonder what's wrong with this fish. I wonder if this fish ate something. I wonder if this fish, you know, is sick for some reason. And then you look up and you notice another dead fish and another dead fish. And you notice that about half of the fish in the pond or in this lake are dead and belly up. At that point, you probably would stop wondering what's wrong with each individual fish, and you would probably start wondering what's wrong with the water in the lake. And then imagine you continue walking in this field and you come across another lake and another lake and another lake and another lake. And half of the fish in all of the lakes are belly up and dead. At that point, you would probably stop wondering what's wrong with the water in that one individual lake. And you would start wondering, what is it in the groundwater that is polluting all of these lakes, that is then causing all of these fish to die? When we think of systemic racism, and when we think of the interventions that we often propose and the focus of our attention to bridge disparities and promote, academic achievement and this whole talk of the achievement gap and everything we do, I think it's important for all of us to really consider at what level our interventions are geared. And if we're kind of proportionately looking, the fish certainly need help and supports. But if we're just constantly supporting the fish and not addressing the water in the lake and the groundwater more broadly, then the fish are going to keep dying as much as we keep trying to save the fish. And so really kind of thinking through in the early education system, what level of interventions are we looking at, and what are the specific types of interventions for groundwater, for the lake level, for the fish at the fish level, because all of them are needed. So there's a few observations that we also want to pull out from here. The first that I'll dig into just a bit more in the next slide is that racial inequity really looks the same across systems. And I won't expand on that now because we'll talk about that in the next slide. The second one is that socioeconomic difference does not explain racial inequity. This is a very common perception. Folks kind of blame racial inequity or try to explain it away by saying, oh, Black Americans or people of color in the United States are more likely to be low income, and so that explains, the gaps in educational outcomes, that explains the gaps in wealth, that explains the gaps in all of these other areas that we see. That is not the case. When you control for socioeconomic status and income, race continues to be a predictor across all of these areas. The third is that inequities are caused by systems, regardless of people's culture or behavior. So if you're just kind of approaching this lake, your very first lake, right, your first instinct is going to be to ask what's wrong with the fish. Similarly, when we're not looking at this, at racial inequity and our early care and education system through this lens of, all of the history Ngazi just talked about, we have a tendency to say, what's wrong with this fish? It must be this fish's culture. It must be this particular behavior that's being promoted. It must be something in the home. It must be, fill in the blank, as opposed to looking at the water in the lake and the groundwater more broadly, and this kind of history of systemic oppression that has been in our groundwater from the very beginning of all American systems. So going back to that kind of first point that I wanted to talk about, that racial inequity really looks the same across systems. This graph is again from the Racial Equity Institute in North Carolina. And the point here is that the red line and the black line never switch places, right? Like in healthcare, African Americans have worse outcomes than white folks. In education, in criminal and legal, in child welfare, in finance, those lines never switch places, right? Across all of the different systems that we have, they're all different lakes, but all of the groundwater is polluting each and every system. And so regardless of what system we're looking at, early care and education is here as well. Kind of those inequities and that pattern of oppression is the same across all of them. And kind of going back to the fact that reverse racism doesn't exist because power is, if we look at this graph, right? Like that line of white Americans kind of stays stable and is always kind of in that position of better outcomes because of the systems that have been created and the policies. So now I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about the Children's Equity Project and about a new report we just released earlier this month that gets at, well, I'll explain it in just a second, but it's really puts forth a number of policy recommendations for the early care and education system and the K-12 education system to try to get to that lake and somewhat to that groundwater intervention level as well. So the Children's Equity Project is a university-based think tank that's housed at Arizona State University that's focused on creating more equitable systems for young children, wherever young children learn. So from birth through kind of the early years. We're made up of 32 partners from 15 different organizations across the United States, and we really focus on the intersections between policy, practice, and research. We focus on a number of different inequities within our learning systems, some of which include discipline, dual language learner issues, tribal issues, the nexus of kind of immigration and young children, anti-bias, anti-racism, disability and inclusion, and other issues. On the left, you'll just see a list of many of the different places where our partners work. So breaking it down, what do lake and groundwater interventions look like? Here is our new report from the early years to the early grades. And what we did with this report is systemic racism is huge, and it's in every system, and it's entrenched, and it's been there from the founding of our nation and much before the founding of our nation. So that can feel quite daunting to take on. And depending on what your job is, it can be quite challenging to operationalize how to bridge those gaps, how to dismantle systemic racism. So the approach that we take at the CEP generally, and the approach that we took in writing this report, was identifying really specific issue areas that we know are disproportionately hurting or marginalizing or oppressing children of color, children with disabilities, children from tribal communities, children from historically marginalized communities more broadly, with the thinking that if we can identify kind of these areas that are specifically failing our children and plug those gaps, we can make progress forward. We won't solve all of the inequities, certainly that young children face, but not even within our system. But we can take actionable steps forward and begin down kind of this road of improving systems and making them more equitable. So the three key policy areas that we chose for this particular report, not to say that these are the only inequities kids face, but within the early care and education and kind of early grades, we looked at harsh discipline and its disproportionate application in learning settings. And we defined harsh discipline as not just suspension and expulsion, which are kind of the two types that we talk about the most, but also corporal punishment, which is still legal in private schools in every state in the nation except 2, and it's legal in public schools in 19 states. Seclusion, which is the act basically of locking a child by themselves in a room, and restraint, which is the act of physically either holding a child or using some kind of tool or there's a category of restraint that's called mechanical restraint, which is also used. The second category we looked at was the inclusion or lack of inclusion of kids with disabilities in learning settings. And for here, we found, for example, that young preschool children, more than half of them are still getting special education services in segregated settings or in settings separate from their peers without disabilities. So we dive into that area. And of course, there's an intersection with race and disability category and place with this particular issue. The third one we looked at was inequitable access to high quality learning opportunities for dual language learners and English learners. For this particular piece, we kind of gravitated around the concept of high quality dual language immersion or dual language instruction. And to the extent that that is equitably, that DLLs or ELs can equitably access those opportunities. We know that the science is quite clear on this, that dual language and bilingual approaches result in better outcomes for DLLs, ELs, and for kids whose home language is English. But we also know that in a lot of places where there's really preliminary evidence and a whole lot of anecdotal evidence that says that in places where kind of bilingual education is taking off, like where I live in DC, that English learners and DLLs are actually underrepresented in those models, despite the fact that for these particular kids, access to bilingual education, access to dual language instruction can make or break their access to a high quality education altogether. It's not kind of this nice enrichment or a really nice add-on to kind of layer on to an existing quality education. It could actually be their education or not. And so we see kind of this pattern societally where bilingualism is valued and seen as very prestigious for some kids, and it's seen as something that's a problem that we have to get rid of and that we have to pound English into for other kids who kind of come naturally with this gift of bilingualism from home. So we dig into that issue as well. So the first area I'll dig into just really briefly in the time I have is harsh discipline. So, you know, Ngozi mentioned earlier that in policies, you know, just a few words on a piece of paper can have a really compounding impact over time. That is the case for harsh discipline. We know that early suspension and expulsion predicts later suspension and expulsion. And we know that it kind of kicks off this trajectory. We know that when kids are pushed out of school, when they're suspended, they lose learning time. And once you kind of get into that K-12 system, if you lose learning time, you lose 10 days of school, then you're behind. And there aren't all these great supports to help you catch up. And if it happens again, then you're 20 days behind. And so what we see is that kind of this catalyzes this trajectory of, you know, missing learning time. You then understandably become less engaged with academics in school because you keep getting further and further behind. It's associated with grade retention. So getting, you know, having to retake the grade again. It's associated with less high school graduation. And then later on, it's associated with interaction with the criminal justice system. So we see really this compounding effect that we know starts in the infant and toddler childcare programs, not even preschool. We see it start earlier than that. And we know reliably that it disproportionately happens to Black children, and particularly to Black boys, but to Black girls as well when you compare them to white girls and the disparities there. So we know it's a huge problem. We know it's one of the most concrete and specific manifestations of the school to prison pipeline that we have in our education system. So when we think about kind of the polls that we started with earlier on and thinking about how our biases affect our perceptions, when we usually think of a suspension expulsion, it's all about challenging behavior, right? It's, you know, and all of our interventions tend to address challenging behavior. But if we think back that some of the correlates of suspension and expulsion are being Black or being a boy or being big, none of those things have to do with challenging behavior. And so really kind of thinking through how bias affects our perceptions as how we're seeing behavior and how it affects kind of the discipline decisions we make are really important. So these are some of the lake or groundwater interventions that we've identified for this particular issue. We provide recommendations across Congress, federal agencies, states, and districts. And I'll just read off a few of those, but we'll direct folks to our website that has the full policy agenda and report. The first is to really pass legislation to end corporal punishment and seclusion and exclusionary discipline and limit restraint across programs that receive any federal money or public money and serve young children. They don't work. There's actually not an ounce of evidence that shows that they have any positive outcome whatsoever. And there's a whole lot of evidence that shows that they have a whole lot of negative outcomes. And so the fact that these things are still being implemented is atrocious. The second is really to look when reauthorization for the Individuals Disability Education Act comes up. Right now there's a 10-day allowance, so kids with disabilities folks are allowed to suspend them for 10 days with not too many restrictions. And they are silent on restraint and seclusion, and kids with disabilities are hugely overrepresented in restraint and seclusion. So it's really to start addressing discipline within that particular law to protect kids with disabilities. And finally, if you look at those last two under Congress, is to increase funding for mental health interventions for providers and for young children and for families, and prioritizing kind of these approaches that help teachers kind of understand bias, understand social emotional, understand how our decisions are affected by our assumptions and our perceptions. If we go to, you know, federal agencies, first and foremost, really reinstating guidance that discourages the use of exclusionary discipline and addresses racial disparities, and looking at reporting for harsh discipline in childcare settings, since we don't have any federal information on that, and there's some evidence that it appears at higher rates there. For states, you know, states similarly to kind of the federal level, prohibiting these harsh forms of discipline because they don't work. Investing in data systems that disaggregate and are able to kind of in real time keep analyzing disparities so that, you know, and then you take that data and identify where the problems are, where the disparities are, what localities need additional support in TA, and then be able to quickly deploy that technical assistance and resources to the places where we're seeing biggest disparities. And then finally, for the district level, you know, districts that reside within states that allow things like corporal punishment don't have to use it. They can make the decision, the policy decision not to use it. So, you know, regardless of what the state policy is, districts also have kind of that leeway. So this next section is about kids with disabilities and inclusion, as I mentioned. Despite the fact that there has been almost a century of research to find that inclusion in general early learning settings with kids with disabilities and with kids without disabilities produce better outcomes. And despite the fact that it's actually a right to be included, and it's a civil right to have an education, and despite the fact that there is a law with pretty clear language and congressional intent on including children as a first resort, we see that most children, at least preschoolers with disabilities, are still getting their special education services in segregated or separate settings. And that number has only inched up by a few percent, a handful of percents over the last like 20 or 30 years. So progress has been extremely slow, you know, despite the fact that it looks like we have everything going for us here. We have research, we have law, we have practices, but implementation is kind of feels like it's falling through the cracks here. So a number of recommendations and things that we've identified here with inclusion, the whole kind of monitoring and accountability system. And okay, the law says to do it, but there's a lot of flexibility in the way you implement that. And then if we're not monitoring to make sure that inclusion is the first resort, the first resort as opposed to not an option, then we don't know if it's happening, and the standards, you know, what good is a standard if we're not measuring it and there's no accountability for not meeting them. So really, one of our key recommendations is to make sure that from the federal level all the way to the state level, all the way to the district level, to ensure that we are monitoring for and we are holding folks accountable for prioritizing inclusion and making sure that we are first considering the setting where the child would be if they did not have a disability. We also put forth a whole number of recommendations on deploying supports to ensure that all of the coaching infrastructure in the state is well equipped to work with kids with disabilities and promote inclusion. At the district or really local level, making meaningful reforms. So that means maybe restructuring budgets, blending and braiding money, providing trainings to special educators, early interventionists, and general early childhood teachers, making sure that IEP teams are trained on inclusion and on making those decisions, and formalizing partnerships between the school districts, which often carry the preschool program, and general early childhood programs, so that we can expand the number of inclusive slots in the community available to kids. So the last one I'll discuss is the dual language learning piece and access to high quality dual language immersion. So in my intro, I spoke a little bit about this, and I think I'm a little short on time, so I'm gonna move to the recommendations here. So here, really the first pattern that you'll see is that we recommend getting rid of all English only programs and discontinuing all programs where you segregate English learners from the general population. Historically, it has been, English only models and English only programs and English immersion has been used as a tool for exclusion. It has been used as a tool really of white supremacy, where we kind of hone in and obsess on the English part to the exclusion of everything else, right? So in Arizona, for example, up until recently, there was this law that required anyone who was categorized as an English learner to spend 4 hours of the school day separate from your peers learning English. And so if you add those 4 hours to lunch, to recess, to transitions, that doesn't leave very much more time for math and for science and for play and for everything else. And so it's probably not surprising that Arizona has one of the lowest, if not the lowest, English learner graduation rate in the country. And so really all of these programs that use this English only as a form of a tool of exclusion and frankly, just in terms of the science, doesn't work as well as bilingual approaches. So in our recommendations, we really kind of recommend across levels to discontinue those models and align with the science and promote more bilingual learning, prioritizing English learners and dual language learners equitably. We also talk through, the one thing that's really necessary to make that happen is the workforce, right? And so really investing in a bilingual workforce that has kind of the necessary skills and competencies to implement dual language immersion models for our nation's many, many DLLs. And then finally, when we think about kind of standards for DLLs across our early ed system, we have Head Start, we have, different childcare, state childcare standards. Through licensing primarily, we have state pre-K standards. Head Start is clear in a way the most comprehensive set of standards for DLLs. And so our recommendation is for states to adopt Head Start standards on DLLs in their public pre-K systems and to really incorporate many of those standards across their QRIS systems to kind of also help kind of move childcare down this trajectory of improving services for DLLs. Now I'll hand it back to Ngozi.
Thank you. So I just wanted to share a couple of resources that we have at the Center for the Study of Social Policy that could be helpful to you. And I won't go through all of it. I'm just making a reference to them so that you can know what they are and you'll be able to find them. So I'll go really quick because I know that we are getting to the end of our presentation. This screenshot that you see here is the Moving Forward Together document. We have it up on our website. And as Debbie pointed out in the chat box, this will be available to you. The slides will be available to you, so you could just Google it and find it. This is our journey. It documents our journey of wanting to become an anti-racist organization. That wasn't our declaration at first. We just wanted, as a staff back in 2003, to focus on more professional development opportunities that would allow us to better understand issues of diversity, equity, and disparities. And we wanted the conversation to be productive, so we brought a consultant in who talked with the staff individually just to kind of take the temperature and see where everyone was. But through that process, we were able to develop like a shared vocabulary of words that are really important to these kinds of discussions. So we defined things like disproportionality, disparity, systemic racism, and we're able to more openly and more honestly just talk about race issues. And it was through that process that we made the stand that we wanted to be an anti-racist organization. And so this resource just documents that journey. And the next slide just summarizes some of the recommendations that came from.
Ngozi,
You're muted again.
Thank you. We think this journey is important to share with you, not because your journey will look like ours and that you should just take this and use a cookie cutter approach, but because we think that some ideas might spark for you in terms of what could happen for you at your organization and ways to advance the conversation of racial equity. So we're just being very, transparent about what our process was. We also have another tool that we think could be really helpful to you in your organizations. So this is a tool that we developed and produced last spring, and it's called Using an Anti-Racist Intersectional Frame. The document contains definitions, so to help everybody who is interested in this work to have a shared way of describing what we see and what we can do about it, and terminology. And then there are guidelines inside this tool to help you think about if you are wanting to truly do anti-racist work, ways in which to guide your work. Because as the presenters pointed out today, this is really hard work and it can become really hard to think about where to begin because it's so complex. So hopefully these two tools can assist you in your work in a really concrete and tangible way. And I will turn it over to Georgia Goldberg.
Thank you so very much, Ngozi. And I am going to try to be quick as well and just being respectful of people's time. I know that there's been a lot of information that's just been shared with you. And for a lot of people, I know sometimes when I come to these conversations, it feels so overwhelming. And it seems like the work of dismantling these systems can be so big that I sometimes walk away feeling like, well, how can I do it as this little person, as a director in my program, or even as a teacher in my classroom? And so what I want to share from our perspective at Hope for New Haven is just connecting people with the understanding that profound changes can occur within those interpersonal relationships that we create in our classrooms and along professional lines as well as in our communities. And these are just, I'm just going to give you some examples of the things that we do each day at Hope. And one of the things that's more important for us to really, to help people to really think about is really connecting your teachers and your staff to those cultural competency standards. We have those in our state standards, and we also make sure that in the work that we do with our teachers and with the work that we do with our children is to connect children to those with activities that really highlight and elevate those competency standards. We are a Christian center. And so one of the things that we try to do is to really think about and to be front of mind, not just the history of why the systems of inequity was established, but also the inconvenient truth that a lot of these slave owners had to confront, which is that if you are going to pursue their strategy of building economic wealth and power, it is fundamentally antithetical to the teaching of Christ. And so that was in the back of their mind and in the front of their minds, and it's also in the front of our minds when we start to think about dismantling these systems. If a person is not a human being, then it's really easy to dehumanize them. And sadly, that's one of the enduring legacy of slavery and the system that was created, which is a dehumanization of people of color. And so as we're doing this work, we have 12 spiritual principles that we focus on with children and make it really concrete. One of them is believers are members of God's family. And we develop these spiritual goals for the children, but also for the teachers to make those concepts concrete for them as well. And so during the month that we focus on, we actually are going into that month, which is August. We talk about not just the biological relationships that are formed in families, but also the social and most importantly, those spiritual relationships. And we believe fundamentally, if we are going to dismantle racism and these systems of oppression, we must first connect people, and especially children, with each other so that they can see themselves as brothers and sisters first and foremost. And really just teaching them the very basic principle of loving and treating each other the way that they want to be loved and because of the way that they want to be treated. One of the things we are very mindful of is the power of images. And we know that these images are powerful tools that subliminally reinforces a narrative or a worldview. So we are careful not to perpetuate Eurocentric depictions of people in the Bible, especially given that these images have been historically used to further dehumanize people of color and to disconnect them from the truth that their lives are precious. We try to stay away entirely from any depiction of Christ and of God, and to ensure that the materials that we use are reflective of the geography and the culture of the people at the time. We use a combination of direct and indirect methods to continue to connect children to the world and to their communities, and we find opportunities in designing our classroom environments to make these indirect connections. And so I am not going to go into detail, but just to kind of, these are just examples of how we arrange our classroom just to connect children to the world and to people in their classroom who are actually coming from all over the world, and just also connecting them with the community around them through these images, as well as books that we create in the classroom that talk about important historical events and as well as just important landmarks in our community. And so children have access to these images and these books in their block area, in their gross motor area, as well as in the library area. So one of the things that we also try to do in our direct instruction is ensuring that our learning experience plan teaches all of our children about people of color from around the world. We say Black history is world history, and as a director, I try to challenge my staff to be knowledgeable, because one of the things we find is that many of our staff don't know a lot of this history, and so they cannot produce lesson plans or learning experiences that teaches these. So we challenge them to become knowledgeable and to provide children with the rich tapestry of the history of people of color, and not just continue to perpetuate this very narrow lens of the history of people of color, more specifically African Americans, through the narrow lens of slavery and the civil rights movement in America. And for our program, while we feel really very good about the work that we're doing in our program, we also know that not every single child attends Hope, and we want to ensure that regardless of where a child goes, that they are having those same early experiences. And so we do work beyond our program, beyond the walls of our program. And one such work manifested itself in our Circle initiative. So one of the things, if people are not familiar with Connecticut is incredibly segregated. And as a result of that segregation, and Ngazi has gone into length as to how those outcomes really produce itself in the times that we're living in now. And for Connecticut, because the majority of children of color are segregated into programs that are provided by providers of that same culture or race, then we also find that some of the economic instability that are found historically in those communities are visited upon providers of color. And so we know that it's not important just to lift up the children and families of Hope, but to also lift up the children and families in the community around us. And this work, this was our initiative, the Circle initiative, really came out of the study that Dr. Walter Gilliam did around implicit and explicit bias. And then as a result, we talked about all of the different ways that providers of color, and by extension, children of color, are disconnected from the resources that they need to grow and to thrive. And as a 501c3, Hope was, we felt that we were uniquely positioned to help to address some of these struggles by soliciting and bringing and securing resources into the space, especially to folks that have been historically disenfranchised. And again, we do that by becoming an organizing force and an avenue through which we can address some of the issues that we identified around licensing, how the lack of resources often manifests itself in our providers not being able to address some of the licensing issue, and how that then further disconnects them from meeting some quality standards, and how it just becomes this really vicious cycle that forces programs and providers into a place where we do not have good, thriving business of color, providers of color, and by extension, the children that are being served in these facilities are, we're seeing some of these negative outcomes for those children. One of the things that we are really very proud about that we have done lots of things for providers pre and post COVID, but one of the things that we have worked to really address, especially in COVID, was to make sure that we are connecting our providers of color with the PPP and EIDL loans that were being made available to business to help them to thrive. We know that about all the many ways that people of color have been disenfranchised in the banking system, and Circle has been instrumental in securing over $250,000 for 100% of our network members with those funds. And one of the things that we also are very mindful of and very aware of is that there are decisions that are being made at every at all these different levels, at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, about people of color and providers of color. Many of the folks that are part of this conversation are intimately involved in those conversations. So one of the things that Circle has been instrumental in doing is ensuring that those voices are represented in those places where we're historically and systematically locked out of. And so we make sure that we're connecting providers' voices to all of our commissioner of our state agencies that touches our providers, as well as with our local politicians and our state and federal politicians. So these are just some of the things that we are doing just to tackle in our very small way and to dismantle some of these systems. And I hope that some of these ideas spark some things that you guys can do, or just simply affirm what you guys are already doing within your sphere of influence. And so with that, I would just like to turn it back over to Lucy to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Georgia, Ngazi, and Chantel, for all of the information that you have provided today. And as we move towards closing out our session, I just want to lift up this quote from our Advancing Equity Position Statement that I think really talks about the work that can happen at the very individual level, the way in which we continue to educate ourselves. There have been some really great conversations in the chat box of book recommendations and the learning that can happen for individuals who are really desiring to delve deep into this space, and how they can expand their worldview, and also by extension then improve and build upon the learning and instruction that happens in their early learning programs. And so I encourage you once again to realize that individually there is so much work that needs to happen, but that there is a responsibility that we all possess and that must happen at every level, whether it's at the programmatic level, at the local governmental level, really thinking about the systems that are in place and how those are governed by our states and our federal governments, and really thinking about how we can move this work forward, recognizing that because of the deeply valuable and important work that early childhood educators have and the impacts that they can play in the lives of young children and their families, how it truly is an obligation and an opportunity for us to advance equity. I encourage all of you to reach out to us. Unfortunately, we were mindful that given the size of the attendance pool for this presentation, there wasn't much opportunity for questions and answers, but we do encourage you to reach out to us as you move forward in this work, and as you are continuing to do this work at an individual level, but also as you are continuing them with your own programs and your colleagues. I want to take a second to thank all of my co-presenters in joining me today and in sharing this information. I want to thank Debbie and the rest of the Build team for opening up this platform and inviting us to be part of this conversation. And I want to thank all of you who have joined us today for taking the time out to be part of this conversation, for expressing your commitment on behalf of young children and families, and to continuously committing and recommitting to really creating a system where all young children have access to educational opportunities that build upon their unique strengths and the values that they bring to the world. So with that, and with deep gratitude, I thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Debbie for just some very quick final wrapping comments. Debbie?
Thank you, Lucy. Before folks sign off, we encourage you to give us feedback on today's session. Some questions are popping up in a survey. We would appreciate you giving us feedback on those, but also typing into the chat book some of your thinking and your reflections on the session. I would sincerely like to thank our session leaders today for this provocative, interesting opportunity. You brought forward some deep concepts and ideas in a very understandable and relatable way, and I got so much out of the session, and I can see from the chat box where people were sharing ideas and resources that many of our participants did as well. We appreciated the contributions from participants in the chat box and would like to thank you all for joining us really so much. Thank you.